I am so happy this afternoon to be joined by New York Times architecture critic Michael Kimmelman. Prior to Michael's current post, he was the paper's longtime chief art critic, and in 2007, Michael created the Abroad column as a foreign correspondent covering culture, political, and social affairs across Europe and elsewhere. It was in late summer 2010 the Times appointed him architecture critic and also made him
11.
the paper's senior critic.
11, 1 year ago.
11,
yeah.
1 year ago. And his articles since then have begun to reshape the public debate about urbanism, architecture, and architectural criticism. I'm doing an Elizabeth Streb. I'm dropping the cards on the floor. I love it. With all of this, I can think of no better person to participate in this conversation on design in the global city. So Michael, thank you again for being here. There's been a lot of time today on East Midtown and the Grand Central Terminal District. So we're going to move away from that and go over to Penn Station. How's that?
Sounds good.
You've written, and I agree, that the only way to fix Penn Station is to move Madison Square Garden. All the tracks lead to that conclusion, so to speak. You also wrote in the same piece that we've spent $4 billion to build a new PATH station downtown that will serve about 60,000 riders.
Optimistically.
Where Penn Station serves over 600,000 and doesn't see that kind of investment. So, do you have any optimism about this? I mean, you know, is this going to go on for decades more?
It's a funny thing just taking over this job and discovering that when you write something like, well, just move Madison Square Garden, it doesn't happen. I don't know why. I don't know what I'm doing in this job. I actually am a little optimistic, partly because of the response to the conversation that, you know, the response to this article was encouraging in the sense that I think there's a hunger for doing something about this site, which is, you know, a blight on millions of people's lives every single day. Yeah, I'm going to Barclays later this evening, and I've been there a few times, and I'm going to write about it shortly. I've been wanting to go and take a look. And I just have this feeling that the Dolans, who own Madison Square Garden and who I gather are very ambitious and competitive people, I don't know why I think that, are going to discover that they have, despite the money they're pouring into Madison Square Garden, now the worst arena in town. Well, they always had the worst arena in town, but now they have the second best arena, which is also the worst arena. I think there may be some. I think there may be some change. You know what? The last thing I'll say about this, I think change like this has to come from public activity, public pressure, and I think, in a sense, Moynihan got people off the subject of doing something about Penn Station. They thought mistakenly that Moynihan might solve the problem. And Moynihan, that idea of moving Amtrak across the street into the post office building would solve this. And when you discover that it doesn't, I think this reopens the conversation. And I'm serious in a way about Barclays. I mean, you know, none of this was going to happen or would happen in the next few years. But even optimistically, if you're looking at it from the Dolan's perspective, they poured in this money, but amortizing it over the next decade or 15 years, they may find that it's a useful thing to find a new home for the garden. It's moved many times before, and maybe we can address this central this central problem for the development even of Midtown West, which I don't know how much we've talked about here today, but is obviously even before Midtown East the focus of development in the city.
Well, there was some discussion on Midtown West, and Vishaan, I can't help but look at you when we're talking about Madison Square Garden, and I want to come back to Barclays. Well, let's come back to Barclays right now. So I was at the opening,
yep.
And so this is sort of a kind of funny thing to bring up, but I thought it was cool, right? So the Jay-Z thing, and so many people in the arena that night were really, I mean, they are young, and they are regular concert goers, right? They get the whole deal of going to an arena and seeing a big thing, and they're boisterous and enthusiastic, but they're kind of low maintenance. I mean, they know what to do, right? They were the throngs of them streaming in and just kind of embracing the place, and it was electric. Right. And of course, they were celebrating having this facility, this arena in Brooklyn, and obviously Jay-Z being there. So I was talking to a house manager who said gee, I said, all this crowd control, and this person said back to me, oh, they are so easy. They know what to do, this audience. They come in, they just are grabbing onto it. Don't get me started on Barbra Streisand. Different demographic, right?
Yeah, yeah.
They call, how do I get in? How do I get there? Is there a ramp? You know, so, but, you know, it's got to do both. It's got to do all of it. So without giving away the piece that you haven't finished yet, what are some of your thoughts about Barclays?
Well, I mean, look, I think you have to, it comes in several parts, so one has to unpack what Barclays is, which is with Atlantic Yards. First, you have the arena and the question of the quality of the arena, and then that arena is related to issues of traffic. You know, I think one of the not surprising but very crucial discoveries of these first weeks is that people take transit. If you offer them transit, this is one of the great transit hubs of the city, they will go, and you don't need as much parking as everyone feared. That issue seems not to be playing out. It will depend upon the continued vigilance of the police and the transit authority and so forth. But that's one thing. The arena itself, how it functions for events there, this is another thing. And architecturally speaking, of course, you know, then there's the question of how Shop dealt with the dud it was handed, which was this very, you know, poor shed. I also think it's not giving away a great deal that they did a really good job of trying to animate that and integrate it as much as possible into that neighborhood. But this is only a small piece of the puzzle. And I think I'd come up talking, I think it was maybe with Vishan, that it's like seeing a man get dressed and he's only got his socks on. In other words, the whole project was still going to obviously involve the towers that will go up around it, all of the development that is supposed to follow for the rest of Atlantic Yards. And then one also has to say, what else should be part of this conversation? And here is where I think, you know, the increasing attention we seem to be paying, and obviously to me this is very important, to issues of public space, the extent to which we think about development, not simply in terms of, you know, where can we get money, and then what can we get out of that money, eke out for public space, but in a sense the opposite way, saying what kind of public spaces, what kind of streets and cities do we want, and then what kind of development can follow from that. So obviously the complicated issues that are to be settled are how to integrate the surrounding neighborhoods, the streets, how to make something that's actually knitted in as activated living streets in the new development of Atlantic Yards. What might be done with Atlantic Avenue, which is you know, an unpleasant block. In what ways Bruce Ratner can be persuaded to try to help enhance Atlantic Avenue, not just on that site, but on the other side where you have the world's...
He'll be here later for the best building.
Ugliest mall.
Just momentarily.
There you go, yeah. So, yeah, so I mean, I think it's a large puzzle. And the only thing I'll say without droning on about it is, you know, it says something that everyone here knows, which is a building doesn't exist in a vacuum, and the design of a building is not something that I think can be separated out as if it's a painting from, or a work of sculpture from its surroundings. And Barclays is a perfect example of that.
Michael and I had agreed that we would race through some different subjects. It's such a great opportunity to have Michael with us today. So, and these things are very much interrelated. So I'd like to take us specifically to POPs, to privately owned public spaces. MAS has an initiative under the direction of Gerald Caden to examine New York's privately owned public spaces, called POPs, to try to develop some new ideas for design, regulation, and the management of these spaces. You wrote the foreword of Ron Schiffman's new book, Beyond Zuccotti Park. In that piece, you pose the following questions to the reader. What is the cost to the public good, to the public discourse, I love reading your words, and to civic freedom if the only way to spread one's message is to buy space? And should we blur the controls, the boundaries, the authority, and the thresholds between public and private space? between streets and sidewalks. So if you don't mind, I'd like to return those questions to you.
You know, one of the obvious things that the Occupy movement in Zuccotti brought up was, first of all, it introduced many people to the notion of publicly owned private spaces, which people hadn't thought about. To the notion of public space, I think, in general, it activated again this conversation about what is public space and how does it work. And it raised certain obvious questions as well, but I don't think we've addressed them. That is, let's say, do we have spaces for things like protest? Can you create a space for protest? Or is the very act of doing so, in a sense, thwart the protest itself? You know, I think one of the things to emerge out of that as well was the need for what you might call ambiguous space. And to design ambiguous space is complicated. Spaces that can be, have multiple lives. This is what Zuccotti turned out to have. It was serendipitously and clearly unintentionally an ideal space for a kind of event like this. But I don't think it was ever planned to be occupied. It was serendipitously good, obviously, because it was like a theater in the round. Its size and the location of it within these tall buildings created a kind of density and concentration which allowed 200 or 300 people to seem like a huge mass. Had the Occupy movement taken place right over here, in Sheep Meadow or wherever, it would have been in the corner of something no one would have noticed. So I mean, the question is, how much can we begin to think about actually creating these spaces? I know I'm answering my question with a question, but I mean, I don't really know that there is an answer. I think it has to emerge out of a new approach towards prioritizing public space and not just seeing them as plazas that we get on, you know, on the ground floors of buildings like this. And then I also think that we need to begin to maybe even think about designing areas and buildings from the inside out. That is to say, saying, okay, what kind of spaces are we going to create, and what does that leave around it? The street, I heard Norman Foster say it a moment ago, you know, we need to think very clearly about the streets. I think that's right. I don't think people realize that the sidewalks are privately owned, and that you know, much of what happens on the sidewalks is determined by the bollards that go up or put up by the building's owners. I mean, it's maybe clear to every single person in this room, but is not to most citizens in the city. So,
well, public realm certainly was I would say, the number one conversation of the day, to be sure. And as I mentioned, MAS is along with Gerald, is in the early stages of a really good investigation on privately owned public space. And hopefully we'll be able to, and I know I'm sure we'll be able to do some
But Jerry's the first person to recognize, of course, that, you know, there are problems when you set out to design spaces that are, let's say, amenable to protest. Or, I mean, I've had this conversation, I'm sure you will too, with him about the complexity of designing spaces that are multiple use and that can act as spaces for, you know, when we talk about political activity, I'm not talking about a protest necessarily. I'm just talking about the idea of people coming together in some sort of social gatherings that are not just a party or not just, I mean, a concert or having lunch outside.
One of the themes of this summit is density. And again, these were themes. This is a theme that was underpinning everything that was being talked about today as well as tomorrow. You wrote in a piece last year, "We live in an era of unprecedented urban migration." The context for that was a statement about urban slums. There are 1 billion people in informal settlements or slums today, and by 2030, there will be 2 billion. New York City is projected to add another 1 million people by 2030, and the Bloomberg administration's policies are guided by this projection. Are you worried about increased density in this city? And kind of related to that, and this is something that Bruce Katz said this morning from the Brookings, and we have certainly talked about at MAS, what do you think of the ideas that New York needs to think and work more regionally, like intensifying Portchester or Newark, say, to support metropolitan growth?
No, I'm not worried about density at all. I think New York can become more dense, and I mean, there are two kinds of densities. I think I wrote that in the context of talking about the expanding global south,
Right.
and then we're talking about very different sorts of, problems of creating livable spaces. I think New York City can become more dense in places. Already, it's not, parts of it are not that dense at all. Just occurs to me that I had a conversation with Jonathan Rose, who was the developer of, as many people know, and he reminded me that he had come up with a plan for the Atlantic Yards development, I think back in the 80s, which had all sorts of sort of, proto-green and other ideas in it that would now be considered standard. But that he was opposed at the time by a lot of sort of environmental types who thought, open space, density is bad. Whatever kind of density is just bad. And, I'm talking to everybody who knows this, but one has to remember that in the course of the last 30 years or so, or the idea about what makes a healthy city seems to have so radically turned itself on its head. And there's a perfect example. I mean, the idea that at some point someone could have looked at that space around Atlantic Yard, which is an open gash in the city, ripping apart these different neighborhoods, and that had been there for years, and could have said, this is better than bringing in neighborhoods and trying to create housing and some kind of activity there. It seems insane. So I think the resistance to density is something I mean, not unbridled growth, obviously, but as with Midtown East and some other areas, I think New York can certainly handle more. I mean, I don't know, I think it depends on what neighborhoods we're talking about, of course, but many parts of the city are actually very low density. And it seems to be developing around different nodes, not doing everything in Manhattan, but looking around the different boroughs, all 5 actually, including Staten Island. There's plenty of room for growth.
Bruce's point about really why New York is the global city that it is and why it is globally competitive is because of the metro region of New York itself.
I understand.
And so so intensifying New York, I mean, it's sort of inevitable, and also what's the alternative? I mean, the city does need to grow, but also finding those opportunities in the region to absorb growth and connect.
Right, well, the connectivity is a no-brainer, and one of the most appalling acts by the governor of New Jersey was, I think, it seems to me, was to cancel that tunnel. Right. Which was really even more than my cockamamie plan.
One of the appalling acts, not the only.
Absolutely
Sorry.
right, yeah. I mean, but this was just a disgraceful thing because it was so crucial for the development of New York and the entire Northeast and rapid train traffic. So of course, everything is connected. Hopefully, that can be rectified at some point somehow. I don't know how.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have a lot more time. So my pet peeve question on parking lots, I'll pass on.
Yeah.
But read all of Michael's. Well, you want to say something about parking lots?
Well,
I thought that was the greatest piece, your piece on parking lots.
Oh, thanks. Well,
Did you get good feedback?
Yeah, I got an enormous amount of feedback. It turns out there are a lot of people who love parking lots out there, or think about them, or want to do. No, but I was just in San Francisco. I see David Baker here, and I was looking around the parklets out there, and the parking day, which started out there, grew into this thing in which people could actually, a kind of institutionalized way by which people could lease parking spaces in San Francisco and turn them into essentially public spaces. And it turns out we do this here, but there's been some resistance, but there are about 4 or 5 parklets in New York. And I think that they're a start of rethinking our relationship to the car in places like Manhattan. So I plan to go back to parking as a subject. It's a good one.
Well, since we're talking about parking and cars, we should talk about cycling, because you've written passionately about the joys of cycling in New York and Berlin. Yeah. So what is your favorite biking route in New York City? And what don't you like about biking in New York?
Well, the big problem about biking in New York, look, it is a dangerous thing to do. And you know, I lived in Berlin for years, and the bike paths there are very well marked. They're on wide sidewalks or just adjacent on the streets, and everyone obeys the traffic laws and only goes in the right direction. And so, I mean, but you know, they've also had decades of acculturation, as have other cities like Copenhagen and so forth, and density and size. You know, those cities do not have the same kind of traffic. So it's dangerous to ride in New York, and I have to say that is a deterrent. My family, for instance, doesn't like to ride. I'll give you a good example. I live on the west side. I mean, coming around this circle, so you can bike up. If I'm at my office, I can bike up 8th Avenue. But then once you get here, then you have to join this sort of traffic circle, which is fine if you're a taxi. But if you're a bicyclist, it turns out to be extremely dangerous. Yeah. And then it doesn't pick up a bike lane anywhere. So it's the disconnection. And I know Jeanette, you know, is working very hard to try to knit together the bits and pieces of the lanes and try to make them a genuine network, at least embed in the city a central network which will be able to outlast the Bloomberg administration. But I mean, I think that is a serious deterrent to even people who are sympathetic to bikes. As far as biking around, I mean, I don't have any, you know, secret routes or something. But I do have to say,
But you do look ahead. You're not always looking up. I mean, you're not always working.
No,
you're not
no.
always working when you're cycling.
No.
Okay.
I know. And I bike. You know, it's the argument about biking. It makes perfect sense, which is that most of us take short trips, a couple of miles. A bike is a perfect thing to do, and to use if you're going to travel. And I think once there's just more bikes, there's going to be this tipping point. It's going to happen. The only thing I was going to say, you asked me where I like to bike, and the one thing I'll say is, we have a wonderful mass transit system. But there are, of course, areas which are a little cut off. So, for instance, for me to get to the Times, I don't do it often, but when I come from the west side, I have to go across these far west avenues. That's not an area where one often walks, but biking through, how can I put it? For a native New Yorker like me, it's rediscovering the city, which is a joyous thing to do, and it's much easier to do on a bike than it is often to do on foot.
You know, they're holding up signs over there that we're out of time. I feel very cheated. And isn't it like, don't I have something to do with this summit? But I'm going to sneak in one little question.
Sure.
You know, it would take like a big answer. And I dropped all these really cool questions. So will you come back next year?
With
We'll check on the schedule.
Of course.
Okay. What's your advice for the next mayor?
Since I'm in this audience, but I actually mean it, I think the next mayor has to recognize that this mayor's legacy is so tied up with improvements to the urban fabric of the city. And this relates to crime and health in ways which may not necessarily be clear to people and to politicians coming in. But I think the biggest message I would try to convey is shepherd these changes along. Do not abandon the kind of focus which has done so much to improve the city, and bike lanes are just one of them. But I think the parks, the whole focus on the city and development and healthy and constructive zoning, it's a precious and difficult thing, and you can see this administration concerned about protecting its legacy. I hope the next administration does.
Thank you, Michael.
Sure.
Really
My
an
pleasure.
honor and a pleasure. Michael
My
Kimmelman.
Thanks.